Welcome to the Psychology World podcast. I'm Connor Whiteley, bringing you psychology news, articles, and other interesting psychology-related articles. Where I can find the podcast notes and more interesting psychology-related things, and you can get your free 8 psychology book box set at connorwhiteley.net. Now let's get on to the show. Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 88 of the Psychology World podcast with me, Con Wiley, and today's episode is on why people don't help us. So this is a great episode that I really enjoy though, because whenever we look at the social psychology topic of like helping behaviour, pro-social behaviour, the thing that constantly comes up is why don't people always help? Because you would have thought that we would always want to help others in any situation that we can. But, of course, as we know, we don't always want to help other people. So this is a great episode that really goes into this topic in depth. And even if you don't really like social psychology, this is a really useful episode that you can apply to everyday life. And yes, I know that's a running theme, though, with everything on this podcast, though, because pretty much I'm only interested in psychology that I can apply to everyday life. And you're probably the same, though. So moving on to the psychology news section. So we're reading from the British Psychological Society Research Digest. And I should also mention that it is Saturday, the 24th of April 2021 as I record this. I almost said 2020 then. So, good time management seems to have a bigger impact on well-being than work performance. As our lives have become busier, desire to do more things quickly and efficiently has grown. The rise of speed reading apps, lack of break taking at work, and a general focus on productivity has shown. Good time management, therefore, are now highly prized both at work and at home. But do such techniques actually work? A new meta-analysis suggests that they do, but perhaps not for the reason you'll expect. Whilst time management skills are becoming more important in evaluation of a job performance since the 1990s, the biggest impact lies elsewhere, in personal well-being. And this I can definitely understand though, because yesterday I was mainly having a business day, so I wasn't doing much writing, and to be honest, I definitely felt a bit, oh god, I've not done anything today because I sort of felt like some tasks have taken me quite a bit long, and I wasn't able to see that I've accomplished as much as I would have wanted, but it turns out that I actually did though, and I sort of I didn't feel down, but I definitely had that sort of feeling. So I really do understand this though, because we want to feel like we've accomplished something, we want to feel that we've done it well. Well, yes, then that we've done it well though, and good time management helps us to do this. So this I really understand, and this I think is really important though. And again though, it's actually quite interesting to see the current thinking, or the more traditional thinking, that time management is only good for job performance actually flipped on its head slightly, because now we know, because of this research and because of this new creative thinking that this person did, we now know that time management helps well-being as well. The next one is describing groups to children using a generic language can accidentally teach them social stereotypes. When we talk to children about the characteristics of boys and girls, our word choice and syntax can profoundly shape what they take away from the conversation. Each attempt to dispel stereotypes can backfire, as we recently reported, and I think I also reported on this, telling kids that girls are just as good as boys at maths can actually lead them to believe that boys are naturally better at the subject and girls have to work harder. Yes, I definitely remember this one from a few episodes ago. Other work has also shown that generic language can also perpetuate stereotypes, saying that boys like to play football, for instance, it can make children believe that all boys like to play football, or that liking football is a fundamental part of being a boy. Now, a study in psychological science shows that when the kids hear these kind of generic languages, they don't just make assumptions about the group that is mentioned, they also make inferences about unmentioned group, as if children hear that boys like to play football, then they deduce that girls do not. And this I think is actually really true though, because not only because of course it's been proven in a study, but I remember this time where I was at a swimming lesson, and I've never liked a football though, but the swimming instructor was a female, and she mentioned that she liked football, and all of us were like, what? You like football, but you're a girl. You don't like football. So this I really do understand, and it is a massive shame though, and I think that the takeaway from this psychology news section is just try and be wary and try and be careful how we mention stuff, But the harsh thing is, though, is that if we tried and lived by the results of all of these studies, then it would just be so hard to live, because like you would constantly be thinking about how you act and like what you say, which I guess to some extent we should, but of course it is actually quite hard. But I think it's just something good to be aware of. And we will do one more, and this one looks quite interesting. Okay, so unmet sexual needs can leave people less satisfied with their relationship, but having a responsive partner mitigates this effect. Open quote. For better or for worse, romantic partners usually have to rely heavily on each other to fulfill their sexual needs. Close quote. So beginning a new paper that attempts to plug a gap in our understanding of sexual ideals and what might buffer against dissatisfaction if a reality doesn't quite match. Sexual incompatibilities are not only common, but they're difficult to resolve, even with couples therapy, note the researchers, yet there's only been limited work to understand precisely what constitutes as an individual's ideal sexual life. Now the work suggests that people's ideas are not met, there are negative consequences for the relationship. However, importantly, the data also suggests that having a responsive or sexually communal partner mitigates this effect. This Psychology News article actually really ties into today's episode, because today, psychology of our relationships, the social psychology of friendships, romantic relationships, pro-social behaviour and more, third edition has actually been released. And I actually talk about this to some extent in the book, though, about communal relationships, and also quite a lot to do with this. And I think it's really interesting because, yes, if these realities are met, then this can possibly lead to a relationship breakdown, because of course we want to be fulfilled and we also want our needs to be fulfilled, meaning that we will most probably break up with our current partner in order to go out and try and find these partners who can sexually fulfill us. But then you've also got the flip side, which I talk about in the book. This I think is really interesting. But this article also flies in the face of monogamy. I've never been able to say like that word though. But this I think is definitely food for thought, and definitely something that we can all take by surprise. So that's enough for the psychology news section. Let's move on to the personal update. So we're moving on to the personal update. So this personal update will actually be really short, because I've not actually been up to that much that would be of interest to you, because I've been mainly doing a bunch of writing and updating newer books. And then I've also been doing more revision. So basically, not a lot actually happens this week though. And I'm actually just going to forego this personal update and just move on to the content part of today's episode after the sponsored product section. But as always, I always love to know your thoughts and feelings on today's episode. So you can always email me, connorwhiteley@connorwhiteley.net. You can always tweet me on Twitter @SciFiWhiteley, and you can always leave a comment at the show notes at connorwhiteley.net/podcast. And I do honestly love to hear from all of you. And the sponsored product for today's episode, as I mentioned in the psychology news section, is Psychology of Relationship, the social psychology of friendships, romantic relationships, pro-social behaviour and more, third edition. So this book I do really enjoy though, because this book though does go in so much depth about why relationships form, and it's a massive misconception within psychology and just within society in general, but that when you talk about relationships, that you're only talking about sexual relationships, but it doesn't. And unless the book specifically says it though, everything in this book can be applied to friendships and romantic relationships. So this book goes into great depth about why they're important to us, and also what the biological, cognitive and social reasons that relationships occur. And then it also goes into the research about how these relationships should be maintained, and then it goes into the pro-social behaviour, and I guess most importantly, how to have a good communication in relationships, and how relationships break down. Sadly though, because it's a fact of life, but it's really interesting to see how it actually happens in a relationship. So that is psychology of relationships, the social psychology of friendships, romantic relationships, pro-social behaviour and more, third edition. Available on all major ebook retailers, and you can get the ebook directly from me at payhip.com/ConWhiteley. And you can also order the paperback, hardback and large print versions from Amazon or your local bookstore or your local library. So that's enough for the personal update. Let's move on to the content part of today's episode. So moving on to the content part of today's episode. So we're going to be looking at why people don't help. And this is a great new section in the Psychology of Relationships book, though, and I think it's really interesting because the vast majority of the theories teach us that we are meant to help others. It's like a form example like King selection theory, evolutionary psychology. They all teach us that we should help others, no matter what. But of course, as we all know, that just doesn't happen though. So this is a really good section where that hopefully you will really enjoy. And like the rest of these episodes for the new book, I will be recording it as a audiobook chapter, and then I will pop in at the end to add a few more thoughts. So I'll see you in a moment. Chapter 10: Why People Don't Help. In the last chapter, we looked at the bystander effect and 3 factors behind bystanderism. So in this chapter, I wanted to investigate the topic of why people don't help in more depth, because bystanderism isn't the answer to everything. Rationality of not helping. To answer this, Bickerman in 1972 ran a study where the participants were led to believe that they were in an experiment with 2 other participants and a confederate. Subsequently, the participants heard a bookcase fall on the top of one of the confederates, and the participants believed the other confederate could or couldn't help the person. Also, they heard the other confederate interpret the event as an accident or not. In short, a participant would have heard the bookcase fall on another person, and if it was an accident or not, as well as if you were needed to help rescue a person. The results showed participants were a lot more likely to help if the confederate deemed it to be a definite emergency and they couldn't help them. This makes sense because if someone is trapped, it wasn't urgent, and you weren't needed help, chances are you aren't going to help because you're not needed. And yes, I can hear the number of readers that are saying, yes, I would still help. I agree, I want to think that, but chances are we won't. When do numbers of bystanders increase helping? I highlight the study below because in psychology, we hear a lot about the negative sides of social groups, social psychology 3rd edition, and the bystander effect. Therefore, I always love studies that turn the current research consensus on its head, since we think the number of bystanders only decreases helping, but it can increase helping in certain situations. Grocomere and Muggy 2015 conducted an experiment where they told students they needed 1 or 4 people to do an experiment, as well as the participants believed they were alone or 10 other people that received the request. The hypotheses were, if 1 person is needed, the number of bystanders should decrease helping, as supported by Lanley and Darley 1968. When others are needed, the more bystanders there should be an increase in helping. The results showed the participants thought helping made less sense when 1 was needed but many were available, as well as when many were needed and only 1 was available. This was caused by the diffusion of responsibility in the first scenario, whereas when the opposite was true, when many people were needed and many were available, this increased helping. Again, I think this study has a lot of real-world implications, because if multiple people are needed to help, then what's the point of 1 person trying? Also, I would love to think that I would still try it, and chances are I probably would, yet it's still interesting to consider. A final study. Lastly, Harrier and White 1985 studied rape scenarios on a university campus to see if men alone or men in groups would help. The results showed men in groups overwhelmingly helped, probably due to feeling safe, and the norm is to help. Critical thinking. Nonetheless, the study is far from perfect, because helping is naturally strong in a natural setting, since humans are inclined to help others. You'll see in the next chapter on altruism how true that can be sometimes. Additionally, there is no discussion of ethics in the study because these participants weren't briefed or informed consent wasn't obtained before the study. Therefore, when someone cries rape, you will know it's an emergency, so the generalizability of the studies might not be as high as you think, due to the results of the study can only be generalized to situations that are clearly an emergency. On the positive side, participants who thought they would have to talk to the participant later helped faster. In addition, the number of Confederates had no impact on this. Gogobel and Carver, 1980. Lastly, and perhaps the most interesting finding, is a public self-awareness versus the bystander effect. I talk a lot more about self-awareness in social psychology, yet I think this is an interesting finding, as it could mean the way we get more people to help others could be to make them more aware of themselves in these situations, since if people know that they're being watched and, let's face it, judged by others for their actions, then it might make people help others. For example, if a person was walking in a street and they saw an elderly lady fall over and no one, including the elderly woman, saw that person, then there's a chance that they would avoid the situation and hope that someone else would help. However, if that person thought about the negative judgments other people would be giving them for not helping, then maybe, just maybe, they would help. It's an interesting idea to think about. So, but this episode I really do like though, because a lot of that is really true though, and you really can apply it to everyday life. And something that I love about psychology, but equally this is quite annoying about psychology and also like human behaviour, because it is so complex, you really cannot say that it's down to one thing, which I guess is really good because then that would make behaviour really easy to study and psychology wouldn't be as fun as it is though. But what I like about it though is that the social psychology book, which is the new edition though, connects to the psychology of relationships. That's if you want to get one, then you might want to get the other to enhance your understanding, because they're both great, really easy to understand books that I really enjoyed. So this was a really great episode, and hopefully though, you really got something out of it. But something else I also wanted to mention though was about the rape scenario, because that is really valid criticism though, because yes, it shows that men will overwhelmingly help in groups, but again, as the critical thinking section has said, those are results that can only be applied to situations where there's a clear emergency. So this is something that we need to think about whenever we encounter psychology research, is that we always need to be wary though about, is it as credible as we think, or are we so amazed by the results that we're missing one of the negatives of the study though. So hopefully though, you really enjoyed today's episode, and please check out psychology of our relationships, the social psychology of friendships, romantic relationships, pro-social behaviour, and more. It's a great book, and people are really enjoying it though, so hopefully you will too. And the book's available at all major ebook retailers, and you can order the paperback, hardback, and large print version from Amazon or your local bookstore, and you can buy the ebook directly from me at payhip.com/Connor Whiteley. So have a great day everyone, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for listening today. I hope you enjoyed it. If you want to see the show notes, then please go to connorwhiteley.net. And if you want a free 8-book psychology box set, then please go to connorwhiteley.net. Have a great day, and I'll see you next time.